There are moments in life when something quietly stops fitting. Perhaps it's the roles that you've carried, the ways that you've described yourself, even the way that others have known and experienced you. They just start to feel slightly out of alignment. And if you live with complex trauma, that experience can go even deeper. Because sometimes it's not just that you are changing, but it's that you are realizing that parts of who you thought you were built around your survival. Welcome to Reclaiming Me, a trauma-informed podcast helping women with complex PTSD heal the lasting impact of childhood attachment wounds from parents and caregivers, so you can finally release people-pleasing and perfectionism and learn to trust in relationships, beginning with the one you have with yourself. I'm your host, Cindy Payne, therapist, trauma specialist, and a woman who has walked this path both personally and professionally. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another full-length episode of Reclaiming Me. I'm so grateful that you joined me today, and we're talking today about an extremely important and relevant topic: identity shifts during life transitions, but specifically through the lens of complex trauma. So if you're navigating CPTSD, your identity is not something that just evolves over time, but rather it is something that often has to be deconstructed and then rebuilt. So for today's episode, here are 3 things that I hope you walk away with after listening today. And that is, first, identity is something that is not fixed. It is something that is shaped, it is adapted, and it's often protected in response to our environments. Secondly, if you have CPTSD, parts of your identity may have been formed around survival strategies. And this is not to be confused with your core self. And third, you have the ability to deconstruct and reconstruct your identity based on your current values, not your past conditioning. So I love this topic of identity because it's really similar to the concept of personality and how things get constructed. And this has always been a concept for me that's been very vague and maybe even confusing at times. And it brings me back to being a graduate student when we had an assignment to write a paper about our personality. And I just remember getting tasked with this and almost feeling paralyzed because it was like, what do you mean my personality? You're asking me to talk about myself and my attributes and my characteristics and how people would describe me. And it was just really disorienting for me. And I now understand why that was, because identity is often described as who we are, but more accurately, it's the collection of meanings that we have made about ourselves over time. But this is something that is shaped by roles and relationships that we've been in and the feedback that we have received, the culture in which we have grown up in, and our experiences firsthand. So when we think about our identity, we might respond with things like, I'm the responsible one, I'm the outgoing one, I'm the difficult one, I'm the one who keeps the peace. But here's what we don't always talk about. Identity is also shaped by what was needed of us. So especially in environments where safety and connection and belonging felt uncertain, we understand why this can be so paralyzing and confusing for some of us to conceptualize. I want to introduce Donald Winnicott. He's a psychologist, and he calls this the false self. So he argued that when a child's environment can't handle their true needs, the child creates a mask. And this mask is not to be fake, but this mask is to survive. So this mask is a protective layer that keeps our true capital S self hidden, where it cannot be rejected. And in the world of trauma research, specifically Gabor Mate's work, we see this as the tension between authenticity and detachment. So remember in our previous episodes when we talked about attachment styles, for a child, our attachment is our survival. So if being your core, true, capital S self threatens your connection to a caregiver, your brain is going to choose that connection every single time. So your identity in this sense doesn't just grow, it adapts. And you don't just become yourself, you become who you need to be in order to stay connected. And this is where complex trauma completely changes the conversation when it comes to identity. So I want to touch on CPTSD and the interrupted self. So with complex trauma, again, our identity development gets disrupted. So think of the primary purpose of childhood. It is to explore your environment, to explore who you are, to explore your body, to explore your personality. And when you are in a traumatic relational situation, you are often scanning for who you need to be. One of the most common patterns here is what Dr. Ingrid Clayton describes in her book, Fawning. She says that fawning is a survival response where we learn to orient ourselves around other people's needs, other people's emotions, and other people's expectations. I touched on Dr. Clayton's work a couple of episodes back, but before she wrote the book Fawning, she wrote a memoir called Believing Me. And in her book, she highlights that fawning is like a physiological soul swap. So what she means by this is that you trade your authenticity for safety. You essentially become a mirror for the other person. So if they need me to be the expert, you become the student. If they need me to be the victim, you become the rescuer. Pete Walker, another trauma specialist, popularized the 4 Fs. And he describes fawning as the total relinquishment of boundaries. So it is not just people pleasing, it is identity shaping. And you are learning things like, who do I need to be right now? What version of me keeps things calm? What version of me gets connection or at least avoids disconnection? And over time, that doesn't just become something that you do, but it becomes who you believe you are. So oftentimes when clients come to me and they begin this trauma work, they will say to me, I don't know who I am. And what I respond back with is, well, guess what? This is not a problem that needs to be fixed. This is where we get to do the work. This is the beginning of something that is more honest. I want to share a couple of my own identity shifts again throughout this episode because this is where things really become more tangible. For a long time, my identity was built around roles that I had to play in my formative years and also the reflections from others. And so if you would have asked me as an adolescent who I would have told you I am the second born daughter. I am the younger sister. I am outgoing. I am a performer. I am a risk taker. I am the black sheep. And that was mirrored back to me and echoed back to me. And it became the story that I carried throughout my childhood and adolescence. And as I've shared on here in previous episodes, when college hit, something shifted inside of me. And this is where my perfectionism really took hold. So, achievement and performance and getting it right became part of my identity. And looking back underneath it all, my fawning was always there. Perhaps it was more subtle in certain moments in my life, but it was consistent. It shaped how I showed up in relationships, how I made decisions, both big and small, how I measured my worth. And when I got to college, I can just remember slipping into that role and just playing the part. I was now a college student. I was an education major. I was in a sorority. I had a boyfriend who's now my husband. But I couldn't have told you at the time what my values were. I just had these labels, these roles that I was playing at this point in my life. I was studious. I was an achiever. I was competitive. I was a runner. So see how these labels just really kind of took hold in me. And then I naturally just leaned into the role of a young married person. And so then you add wife to this identity. And then shortly after that came motherhood. So now I'm someone's mother. I have to be responsible. I have to be stable. I have to be perfect. As motherhood evolved for me, I was a stay-at-home mom. And then I was a working mom. And then I was a graduate student who was also still a mother and still a wife and a teacher. And then I was a school counselor. And then I was a therapist. And then I was a non-drinker. So again, identity continues to expand, but it's also attaching to things. And now I'm in another big transition in my life. And I can say this here on the podcast today in this episode because by the time this airs, I will have already made the announcement that I'm going to be relocating to Northern California this summer, where our family business resides. And I'm also going to be an empty nester. And I'm also still going to be a therapist. So I will continue to see my Texas clients virtually if they so choose to stay with me. And I'm also going to be in person with California residents. And I'm going to be practicing therapy out there, and I'm going to be helping out with our family business. And this is really bittersweet for me because I am a native Texan. That's another huge part of my identity. I very much identify with the Texan culture that I was raised in, and also not 100% of that culture aligns with my identity anymore. And so now I'm going to be a native Texan, but also a Californian. And there's a lot of excitement to this, and there's a lot of grief that's wrapped up in this. I've poured my heart and soul for the last 6 years into my private practice here in Texas. And here's also what I'm naming for the first time very clearly. I am all those things, and I am also a CPTSD survivor. I am also a recovering perfectionist. And I am also a person who is learning how not to fawn. And what is different now is this. I am no longer building my identity around other people's expectations. What I'm doing instead is I am building it around my own values. And values have always been a really tricky concept for me as well, because I grew up in an environment where the values that were handed to me are not necessarily the values that I'm choosing to carry with me into this next phase of my life. And I can say with a ton of respect for my grandparents that they instilled a very clear moral compass in me, and I have the utmost gratitude for that. But also, there was a lot of shame and guilt that was handed to me growing up in that environment. And I do understand now that a lot of this was unintentional. It was from fear. It stemmed from fear. It stemmed from their own trauma. So I have accepted that and I have forgiven that. And I have also chosen not to bring that into my own family and my own life. And so I've done values work with my own clients. I've done values work as a client. And what I can say now is that the values that I am choosing that are most at my core, most true for me are honesty, number one, and inner harmony, number two. And so instead of asking, who do I need to be for you to accept me? I am asking, what aligns with honesty and what supports my inner harmony? And if it is not honest to me, and if it does not bring or support my inner harmony, it has to go. It just does. I can no longer carry those things forward with me because it's just incongruent with who I am. And that is hard work, again, because not everything comes with me, right? This question, what aligns with my honesty and what supports my inner harmony, those questions change how my identity continues to form. So if this resonates with you, I want us to talk about the reconstruction of our identity, because again, this is not a process that happens overnight. And it is not an easy process. So I'm not going to lie to you. This process is a phase of deconstruction. So it has to start with a good, hard, honest look of who you are and where you're at in your life now. And it requires, I think, demolition. So you can think of deconstruction and demolition as almost the same thing, but we got to blow shit up, right? We got to blow it up first. And that's the painful part of it, because when we deconstruct or demolish, what we are left with is this kind of rubble in front of us. And we have to decide for ourselves, am I willing and ready to let go of beliefs like I have to keep everybody around me happy, or my worth comes from what I do for other people or what I do in the world, right? Or I need to meet expectations to be okay. This is a phase that I have to tell you, it is incredibly disorienting. When I was going through the thick of it this past year, I was doing some reading about it because I think that's just how I try to make sense of things. Like I can go down rabbit holes and I need to become the expert on something. There's pros and cons to that, right? I recognize that this can be a little bit of the intellectualizing that we can struggle with sometimes. But there's something that I learned called the disorientation of self-discontinuity. And that's just a really eloquent way of saying that there's a biological reason for this process feeling so uncomfortable. Okay. So academic research into trauma brings forth this idea of self discontinuity. And really, what this means is that chronic trauma, and especially chronic relational trauma, can actually disrupt our brain's default mode network, or DMN, if you've ever heard that referenced before. And our default mode network is the part of the brain that creates a consistent sense of me or sense of self over time. So think about it as like, okay, I've blown shit up and now I am no longer willing to fawn. I am no longer willing to perform. And it's not just that I am changing a habit, but rather I am essentially asking my brain to rewire its entire map of who I am. So if you're in the middle of this, or you're about to start this process and you feel lost or like a fragmented version of yourself, please know that this is not a failure. Rather, it's a neurological side effect of healing, because you're not just changing behavior, but you are changing the meaning that's attached to said behavior. And that is a lot, right? So anytime you fawn now, you're going to have this realization of like, oh, that's not aligning with how I'm feeling on the inside. I am doing this to stay connected to this person or this idea. And that is very uncomfortable, because once you know it, you can't unknow it, right? But if you'll hang in there with me and you'll hang in there with yourself through the process, there comes this beautiful reconstruction phase. And the reconstruction phase is not a phase where we grab new labels, but rather we are choosing what actually aligns. And so here's a new insight. Choosing authenticity over attachment is where we begin to flip Gabor Mate's principle on its head. So let me explain. If childhood was about choosing attachment over authenticity, being ourselves, then reconstruction is the brave act of finally choosing authenticity, because we no longer need to stay connected to a specific person in order to survive. We're adults now. We can get our own needs met, but there has to be this process of risk taking by showing our authentic selves. So again, as an adult, our survival no longer depends on mirroring others. And now we are safe enough to prioritize our own truth over someone else's comfort. And what anchors us is our values. So you might begin asking questions like, what matters to me now? What feels true to me now, even if it's unfamiliar? What feels true in my gut? What feels internally steady instead of externally approved? And slowly, if you can stay with yourself through these questions, your identity begins to emerge again. Not as something that you perform, but something that you live from. So I want to shift into Wednesday's midweek reframe. So if you're new here, you'll learn that I do a mini episode every Wednesday that follows our full length episode. And it's usually connected to the content that's covered in the full length episode. So I want to give you kind of a little roadmap as to where we're going with this. There's another layer that tends to show up along identity shifts, and that is guilt and shame. So as you start to change, as you stop fawning, as you stop perfecting, as you start making decisions that feel more aligned with your values, guilt and shame can come with you. And that is not because you are doing something wrong, but because somewhere along the way, you were taught to carry this. So in the next mini episode on Wednesday, we're going to be talking about how guilt and shame shows up during these identity shifts and how we can begin replacing it with something that feels more grounded. Things like, I did the best I could with what I had at the time. This is way more compassionate than what guilt and shame feel like. And we're going to start teasing apart the difference between guilt and shame. So if you're still a little unclear on how to distinguish the two, you're going to want to join me on Wednesday's midweek reframe. So let's come back to the 3 takeaways from today's episode. Number 1, your identity is not fixed. Your identity is something that is shaped over time, and it is often influenced by what we needed to survive. Secondly, for those with CPTSD, identity can form around your survival responses like fawning. And that is tricky because it can blur the sense of self. And finally, healing allows you to reconstruct your identity based on your current values, not your past conditioning. So before we sign off for today, I want to leave you with a few questions to sit with. If you've spent a lifetime fawning, these questions might feel a little loud or uncomfortable, and that is okay. That is just your true capital S self starting to speak up. And the first question, I call it the performance check. So if I knew for 100% certainty that everyone would still love and accept me, what is something that I would stop doing right now? And for me, my quick answer to this was I would stop saying yes to things that didn't align with what I was feeling internally. And that means relationships. That means obligations. That means just being agreeable just to appease, right? So that's how I would answer that one. I would stop saying yes if there was even an inkling in my body that felt like it was going to be a no. And the second question, I call it the I am audit. So think of the words that you have used to describe yourself, like helpful or quiet. Is that really truly a core part of who you are? Or was it a role that you had to play to stay safe? For me, again, I'll give you an example. If you were to ask me to complete the phrase, I am today, I would say, I am brave. I am complex. I am an introvert. I am a highly sensitive person. I am very curious. I am unsure sometimes. I am ever evolving. And it's so interesting how I frame that answer today versus even a couple of years ago. I think if you were to ask me to complete that a couple of years ago, I would have given you labels, titles, mother, wife, therapist, runner, um, native Texan. And yes, I am all of those things, but that is not me at my core. That doesn't describe me. That just describes how I've shown up. So, as we've explored today, reclaiming your identity is a really beautiful process, but I will tell you honestly, it is not a quiet process. Because when you start choosing authenticity over attachment, your internal system might go into panic at first. It is used to this old survival self that kept everybody happy. So when you start setting boundaries or making decisions for yourself, a very specific, very loud guest usually shows up, and that is guilt again, and it's neighbor shame. So if you're feeling the weight of either one of those right now, that sense of choosing myself equals hurting others, I want you to stick around for this next mini episode. Because again, on Wednesday's midweek reframe, we're going to be talking about why guilt even exists, how it's actually a sign of growth, and how we can start replacing that heavy, I'm doing something wrong, with the grounded truth of I am doing my best. So I'll see you back here soon. Thanks for joining me today. Thank you for spending this time with me today. I hope you leave feeling a little lighter, a little more grounded, and a little closer to trusting yourself and your inner experience. If this episode resonated with you, please follow or subscribe so future conversations can meet you when they're needed. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, consider sharing this episode with them. That's one of the ways this work reaches the people who need it the most. You can find me on Instagram at CindyPayneRooted, and you can also visit me at cindypayne.com, where you'll find all episode links, blog posts, practice updates, and a free people-pleasing style quiz designed to help you notice your patterns with more compassion. And remember, every small step towards healing, self-trust, and presence matters. You are worthy of this journey. Thanks, everyone.